Hi everyone, thanks for joining today's ethics webinar. I'm Elaine Kohler, CEO of PRINZ, and it's my pleasure to welcome Tim Marshall, who's a PRINZ Life member and probably our go-to guru on ethics, to take today's webinar. You might notice on your screen you have the ability to also download the code of ethics as we go. This webinar will be recorded and the slides will be sent out probably tomorrow with a link so you can go back and review the webinar at any time. There'll also be an opportunity to ask questions as you go, so just go to the little dashboard on your right and type in your questions. So if you've got a question, perhaps don't hesitate, hold back, just ask it as you go. And there'll also be an opportunity to respond to some polls as we're proceeding through the webinar. At the conclusion of the webinar, please respond to our survey. It's only 2 questions. Thanks, everyone. Over to you, Tim.
Oh, thanks, Elaine. Hi, everyone. We'll kick straight into it because I think we've got quite a lot of territory to cover and hopefully we'll get through most of it. So just on this front slide, I remember PRINZ Life member Cedric Allen observing that to be a profession, a vocation must have a body of knowledge and a code of ethics. So our code of ethics is a foundation stone for our profession. As you can see in that subheading there, the Code of Ethics sets behavioural standards for public relations and communication management practitioners that help us to win society's trust in our profession. That's really important because our industry is not regulated, and if we regulate ourselves well, we won't have heavy-handed government regulation coming in over the top of us, and that can happen, and it did happen with the real estate industry a number of years ago when Parliament lost confidence in the real estate industry's ability to regulate itself in a way that would protect the public interests. So having ethical standards and policing them is the starting point, if you like, for winning trust of society at large and the people we serve. Okay. Ethics. Ethics goes back to Aristotle. We don't need to concern ourselves too much with the different branches of ethics, but just looking at those sub-bullet points that you've got there on the screen in front of you, the virtue ethics, deontology and consequentialism, those are the 3 main approaches. So virtue ethics and deontology both focus on the action rather than the outcome. Virtue ethics measures actions against some given set of virtues. So an example is Stoicism, which is the virtues of wisdom, justice, fortitude, and temperance. So if you keep in your mind that virtue ethics emphasise the character of the person making the actions, deontology compares a person's actions against some duty. So deontology emphasises the character of the actions. It's concerned with the means, whereas consequentialism, that's concerned with whatever the best outcome is for the action. So, for example, under utilitarianism, the goal is to take whatever action maximises happiness, regardless of the nature of the action. So consequentialism, in summary, emphasises the ends, not the means. So moving on, our code of ethics. I'm not an ethicist by training or a philosopher, but I'm reliably informed that our code of ethics falls into the deontology category. So it's a set of rules that's conduct based on agreed common values of PRINZ members. So why do we have a code of ethics? To reinforce what I said in the opening slide, the reason for having a code of ethics is set out on the slide: to formally set out principles and standards of conduct for PR practitioners and communications managers that 1, provide guidance for PRINZ members and our employers, and 2, set reasonable expectations for society within which we operate. The PRINZ Code of Ethics, so let's look at the structure of it. Key points, there are 3 parts. An introduction, which spells out very succinctly what PR and communication management professionals do. Our previous code of professional conduct didn't have this, and we felt that was a shortcoming, particularly around PR people being advocates for their organisations. That wasn't fully understood by a lot of people outside the profession. Second point, there are the values. So looping back to the previous slide, our code of ethics is a deontological code. Ooh, that's a word. Because it's based on an agreed set of values that guide our behaviour. One point I would make, and I always make when I'm talking to APR classes, for example, is as an organisation, we should be continually checking these values and our behaviour against real life situations. We're going to look at a few of these soon, but we really need to be testing what we've got here in our code, which is, in theory, if you like, against what actually happens. Then thirdly, there's the code itself, the rules of conduct, which align with the values, and we'll get into that in a lot of depth in a moment with a few examples to run through. The current code of ethics was written after the Timberlands case, which I'll talk about later, which was around the year 2000, around the turn of the century. This case also coincided with reviews of code of ethics of the Public Relations Society of America and the Institute of Public Relations, or the IPR, in the UK. So our code drew on their experience and was deliberately aligned with theirs. PRINZ is also a member of the Global Alliance of Public Relations and Communication Management, along with about, and I'm going to say 80, but Elaine might be able to correct me on this, is about 80 national bodies?
Not sure on national bodies, but it has 160,000 members.
160,000 members, so there you go. And if you look at the Global Alliance website, you'll see that our code aligns with the Global Alliance code. So first part of the code, introduction to the code. As you can see there, very succinct summary of what it is that PR and comms management people do. And that sets the scene both internally for our members and externally for the people who use our services, and if it comes down to it, for anyone who might protest what we're about to do, or about what we do, and for regulators or for anyone else who takes an interest in our work. So perhaps give you just a few seconds just to read through that on the screen. As I said, it's important we included the fact that we are promoting the views of those we represent. It seemed to be not fully understood in the Timberlands case. And so that introduction will emerge as we go through the values in the code itself. So this is a brief summary of the PRINZ values. You'll find them in full, all 12 values, on the PRINZ website in the Code of Ethics PDF. So under advocacy, we serve the public interest by acting as responsible advocates for those we represent. Honesty, it's about being accurate and truthful. As we'll see as we go through, these aren't always as straightforward as they might seem. Expertise, that's about acquiring responsibly using specialised knowledge, and also about advancing the profession through research, really important. Independence, it's about providing objective counsel and being accountable for our actions. Loyalty to those we represent, and also safeguarding the confidences of present and former clients and employers, actually in future ones as well, because we might be in a situation where we're applying for a job and learn about a possible employer or client, and that information must be kept confidential as well. Something that I realised in my revision for this little exercise. Fairness includes respecting all opinions and the right of free expression, and we'll come up against an interesting little example of that in a moment. That's been in the media spotlight lately, hasn't it? Okay, let's rip into the code itself, advocacy and honesty. So from the values, that progresses to the code, and that sets down the behavioural requirements for members. And each of these has its own set of implications. So looking at the first one, providing independent, objective counsel for clients or employers means that we've got a responsibility to provide expert advice on how to address the public relations and communications challenges that our organisations face, be they our employers or our clients. We won't always have the answers, which is why being able to seek support or second opinions from our colleagues is important. Moving down to the second point, promoting the ethical, well-founded views of clients or employers means that we've got a responsibility to check that their views are well-founded. If there's reason to believe that they're not, then again, we need to find ways to respectfully question and challenge. In the content or the additional material right at the end of this presentation, there's a link to a video by a Vodafone head of communications by the name of Matt Peacock, and I really recommend that you have a look at that. It's only about 4 minutes long, but it's fascinating, and it argues that we should have a license to interfere, as he puts it, to get into the bowels of an organisation, and he says that Vodafone gave him the mandate to do that within his Vodafone. Fascinating, great video. Really recommend that you watch it. Being honest and accurate in all communications seems pretty straightforward, but there'll be times when telling the truth is embarrassing because someone's done something that's not right, and jobs, livelihoods, or money are on the line. Think about crisis communications. That's a classic case when telling the truth is challenged. So there's a motivation, or there can be a motivation, to cover up or mislead. I think on the bright side, with things like product recalls, these days businesses are much better at fronting up and telling the truth, because society has become more accepting of early admissions of failure, especially if organisations take responsibility to address the problem. Avoiding deceptive practices. This one links to the one above, and they can come about because something's gone wrong, or there's something embarrassing to say, or because people are being pushed to achieve something that's either unachievable or very hard to achieve. So let's have a look at a couple of examples. So I'll read this out quickly. 2:55 p.m. British Summer Time on the 11th of September 2001, a date that may be familiar to you, after both the World Trade Center towers had been hit in attacks, but before either tower had collapsed, Joe Moore, a special advisor to British Transport, Local Government and Region Secretary Stephen Byers, sent an email to the press office of her department, which read, "It's now a very good day to get out anything we want to bury. Councillors' expenses? ? When the email was leaked to the press nearly a month later, it provoked a media storm, predictably dubbed Spingate by the British press, and Moore was forced to apologise. She actually made a gaffe later, this woman, and ended up losing her job. She seemed to be rather gaffe-prone, I think. Anyway, when I've talked to PR practitioners about this before, in APR classes, for example, we've had discussions about how the release of news is timed to pick up or to be overlooked, depending on whether it's good or bad for the organisation. In other words, you're saying that it's sort of standard practice. So here's something to ponder, and we've got a quick poll for you to do right now, which hopefully you'll all be able to see there on the right-hand side. So the poll has been launched, and we'll just give you a few seconds to answer it. This isn't a test. It's just, I just want your honest opinion, and it's to stimulate thought. And as soon as we've got the results, we'll feed them back to you. Fascinating technology, this. We can see when the results are coming in. So here we go. I'm going to call time on this and say that 29%, or close to a third of you, said that the question, would you say that sending out bad news on a big news day is unethical? 12% said it's acceptable practice, and 60% said it depends. So really interesting. And as I say, it's not at all unexpected, because our lords and masters more or less expect that this is a fundamental skill that we'll have, is to be able to time our news releases to meet the news cycle. So it wasn't perhaps, I think this is interesting, it comes back to this point about setting out what it is we do, and it's worth pondering too what our practices are internally within PR practice and what they might be thought to be outside in society generally. So if, for example, this became a big news issue, then society might condemn it and we might review what we do, and so would the people who we work for review the way that we do these things. But it's really interesting, and I think we need to do much more of this, is pondering why it is that we have these particular things. Oh, we've got a comment.
Just from Catherine Arrow. So she was a special advisor, political appointment rather than practitioner, a difference that gets missed all the time. And she's lumped in with PR practitioners. She was an ex-journo.
So Catherine's referring there to Jo Moore, the woman who sent the note out to her department suggesting that this would be a good time to, for example, bury councillors' expenses, which was obviously a requirement. They had to get that news out, and it was obviously going to be that sort of news. They'd meet their requirement to get the news out, but it would be swamped by the news of the day. Okay, let's move on to the next one. We've got more of these polls coming up for you. It's so exciting. Do you want to just flick onto the next screen? There we go.
Yeah.
Oh, is it going backwards?
That one?
That's the one we're after. Sorry, we were there. My bad. I'll let you read this, but I'll spin through it as well. In May 2012, the government set 10 better public service goals. So these were their 10 top focus areas for the public service. One of these goals was a real stretch goal, what you might call a super stretch goal, or BHAG, big, hairy, audacious goal, to reduce criminal offending by 25%. Even though people who know this sector very well, people like Kim Workman, who heads an organisation called Rethinking Crime and Punishment, who's a former senior person within corrections. I think he might have actually headed it, and is now an advocate for rethinking the way that we do crime, and he's also an academic. He and others said that a more realistic target would be about 5%. When the goal was announced, 2 corrections department statisticians resigned, and I'm led to believe that this was because they could not see how the target would be achieved without changing the way that corrections counted criminal offending. So Kim Workman then claims that corrections spent 3 years manipulating the statistics, including reducing the time span from reoffending from 2 years to 1 year, and saying that breaches of parole and probation could not be counted. And he says that for academics who are interested in this area, comparing the new stats and the old stats was like comparing apples and oranges, and they had to turn to the Salvation Army's policy unit for better stats. In May 2017, 5 years after the introduction of those better public service goals, or that particular goal, which bear in mind that this was a biggie because this was one of just 10 top goals, the government announced a 4.5% reduction in reoffending, so very much in line with what the experts had sort of said beforehand, although that was actually over the lower goalposts that they'd set by changing the rules. At that time, the reoffending goal was withdrawn. They were in the stage of re-evaluating what the new goals would be anyway, and other goals were introduced. So the question this time is, have you got it there?
That one?
Yeah. If public relations and communication management is required to announce fudged data, it's put to one side your view of whether corrections had done this or not. But let's talk about this and say, if you, as a public relations or comms manager, were required to announce fudged data, is it A, dishonest, this is unethical, B, not your responsibility to be concerned about if you don't have any direct relationship to that fudged data, or B, you're not decided on it? So let's have another go at this poll thing, shall we?
So just while everyone's voting, we've just had a question come in. So did the council take Jo's advice and actually release the information?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know that they did actually. That has sort of become lost in the mists of time and in the furor that that came up around it? I don't know that they did. Maybe some. We've got Elaine. Elaine is telling me otherwise. Maybe Catherine could help answer that question. So again, these questions are really just provocations for us to think hard about the actual implementation of the code in day-to-day situations, bearing in mind. So this is important, bearing in mind that the code says members shall provide independent, objective counsel to clients and employers. Are we actually able to do this and take responsibility for our actions? So how far does it extend? 94%. Whoa, that's on the boundaries. Say this is unethical. 6% say it's not their responsibility, and everybody's made their mind up. Good work. Oh, well, that's very interesting. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to the second part of the code, which is conflicts of interest. So under conflicts of interest, a member shall disclose promptly any existing or potential conflict of interest to affected clients or organisations, and disclose any client or business interest in published or broadcast editorial work. If you do this up front, it'll keep you out of a lot of hot water. I know from with the first one, I know from personal experience with my consultancy that this can be a challenge for consultancies. The conflict of interest question, not necessarily disclosing it, but the conflict of interest can be, because consultancies tend to build up expertise in a particular sector, and you may be denied the opportunity to have a number of clients in that sector because existing clients perceive a conflict of interest, even though this may not exist. So again, this is just one of the very real challenges of meeting these requirements. Disclosing interest in published or broadcast editorial work. In today's age of social media, we operate under pen names or assumed names or identities, and it can be really easy, and we all know what it can be like in the social media scape. It can be positively nasty, and I suspect that some of those comments that are made would never be made if you were sitting across the table from somebody. So that's a little bit of an aside. That's getting into another area, but certainly in terms of making it known who you are and who you're working for is part of our code. Okay, let's look at an example here. This example, which you can read on the screen, but I'll summarise it for you. So this was a clear conflict of interest, not so much perhaps for the practitioners, but for the organisation. So the background is that EY, which is one of the big four accounting and consulting firms, took on the sponsorship of the National Business Journalism Awards, which seems like a logical thing for EY to do, to build profile and relationships with the business media. But it clearly wasn't thought through as well as it might have been, because NBR journalist Karen Shearer put in an entry to the award which alleged accounting irregularities at photocopier printing company Fuji Xerox. The problem is that that company was an EY client, and EY decided the best thing to do was to withdraw Karen Shearer's entries from the awards. When they did that, Rebecca McPhee, who was an independent judge on the judging panel, resigned in protest. And when other journalists got to hear about this, other journalists from NBR, NZME and Fairfax, they withdrew their entries in solidarity, and they also wrote stories about that. So it sort of torpedoed the purpose of the exercise in the first place. So again, to get your grey matter moving, if you were EY's PR person, how would you have dealt with this situation? As I say, clearly there was a conflict of interest. Would your advice be, once they decided to actually withdraw, and it's not entirely an ethical question, but it's a good little conundrum, would you select one of the following? Offer to reinstate Karen Shearer's award entry, recommend EY shut down the awards, or don't know, or some other course of action that I haven't outlined here. And we're racing this time. Thank you. We're doing all right, I think. Just as you're filling out the poll, it's interesting to consider whether EY's PR people were involved in the award. You'd have to think they would have been, and whether they thought through this situation actually arising. Oh, and just while we're waiting for this poll to close, we're informed that Joe Moore released the allowances on the 10th of September, and I won't read the rest of that comment. so she did it. She did it herself, perhaps. Yeah. Okay. So of the 80% of people who voted, 65% said to offer to reinstate Shearer's award entry. That's interesting. That means, you know what that means, of course, don't you? That you'd have to go against Fuji Xerox's wishes, probably. 6% said to recommend EY shut down the awards, and 29%, nearly 30% said don't know or some other course of action. You can imagine what you can be interesting to consider what those other courses of action might be. People will probably have strong views on that. Creative solutions to get around the pickle they found themselves in. Okay, let's move on to the professionalism section. So, first point, a member shall actively pursue personal professional development. You're doing that right now by being on this webinar. Good on you. If you're not on the River program, that's another good thing that I really recommend that you do. It really helps you to, I think, just reflect on what you're doing as a practitioner. It certainly helped me do this, to reflect on what it is that I wanted to be as a practitioner, as much as anything else, as much as it is accumulating professional knowledge in the field that you're in. Second point, explain realistically what public relations activities can accomplish. The point there is don't oversell. It's not good for you, and it's not good for the profession's reputation. This is a point that I'm going to get myself in trouble here by not remembering a name. I'll back out of that and come back to it later. Third point, counsel colleagues on ethical decision-making and decline representations of clients or organisations that urge or require actions contrary to the code. These two are a little bit circular, I admit, but they reinforce that your responsibilities to yourself, your colleagues, and to the profession. And finally, not to engage in irrelevant or unsubstantiated personal criticism. So you absolutely may and should attack the arguments that your opponents put up using logic, evidence, or whatever your belief system is, but this should be done respectfully. So let's have a look at another example. Moving on. So this is the aforementioned infamous Timberlands case, which I've summarised up there on the screen for you. So in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the government state-owned enterprise Timberlands used public relations consultants to lobby government and build public support for logging of West Coast native beech forests. So just to explain, as a state-owned enterprise, Timberlands was required to do this logging. That was their job. That was their main business. You know, it was certainly a big part of their main business. And there was an obligation on them to try to pay a dividend to the government. So Timberlands management were very diligent. That's what they were determined to do. And they, in order to get away from conservationist protesters, they hired a PR consultancy to lobby government and build public support for them to do that, fill that role. So on the other side of the coin were the conservationists who didn't want the West Coast beech forest to be logged, and so they organised tree sit-ins, quite spectacular, put their point of view to politicians and the media. They graffitied walls in Wellington with slogans, telling Timberlands to get out of the West Coast. And so important to note here that the people who are against the logging ranged from activists who were prepared to break laws in order to promote their cause, through to really mild-mannered elderly forest and birders whose strongest action would be writing letters to newspaper editors, and that's important when we get down to considering the complaints. So writers Bob Burton and Nicky Hargo wrote a book called Secrets and Lies. It's possibly the only complaint to a PR body that's been encapsulated in a whole book, accusing the consultants of unethical behaviour, and they laid complaints with PRINZ, which were heard by a PRINZ ethics panel, and then subsequently reheard by a high-ranking lawyer, Hugh Rennie QC. Some other time I can tell you more about that, which was interesting, in inverted commas. So it's Hugh Rennie's rulings that you see here. So Hargo and Burton said that the consultancy had paid a student to attend private meetings of a university environment group that was at Victoria University and report back to the consultancy, essentially to spy on the group. And Hugh Rennie said that ruled that was unethical. They said the consultancy had a policy of describing all opponents as extremists, regardless of whether they were activists, who were probably fairly described as extremists, through to the mild-mannered opponents of logging, who obviously were not extremists. So the code was actually rewritten partly as a result of this very case, but this complaint now could probably fit under the irrelevant or unsubstantiated personal criticism clause, and Hugh Rennie said that this was unethical. Hargo and Burton said that the consultancy drafted letters for members of a pro-logging West Coast advocacy group called Coast Action Network to sign. The allegation here was that Coast Action Network was really just a front for Timberlands, not really a grassroots community organisation. And this is often referred to as astroturfing, where PR firms or organisations set up organisations that appear to be independent but aren't. So astroturf instead of grassroots, obviously. So in this case, Hugh Rennie said that Coast Action Network was actually a genuine organisation. Coasters wanted economic activity on their patch, and that helping to draft the letters was a legitimate PR exercise, which is a moot point. We could argue it some other time. And there was a complaint that the consultancy was too aggressive in the language it used in the media, but Hugh Rennie said that actually both sides used quite aggressive language and it wasn't over the top and that was fine. So there very quickly is a full book, which probably occupied about 2 years of my life as we went through those rulings. But that's the Timberlands case summarised. And I'd again recommend that you have a look at that, because that really has been a formative case for the PRINZ Code of Ethics. Let's go on to balancing openness and privacy. Point 4. This is a huge area. We have acts of parliament requiring openness, i.e. the Official Information Act, and private companies also have disclosure responsibilities if they're listed on the stock exchange. And on the other hand, if we're talking about balancing, we have the Privacy Act, which is designed to preserve people's right to personal privacy. So this is too big a topic to cover right now, but I'd strongly encourage you to familiarise yourself with the statutory requirements around openness and privacy as a baseline to understanding that clause of the code. Secondly, respecting the rights of others to have their say. This can be fraught, and we'll have a look at a very topical example in a moment. Then being prepared to name clients or employers. You have to say who you represent when you contact the media or any other stakeholders on behalf of the organisations that you're working for. Not relate to that question. And finally, in this section, safeguarding the confidences and privacy rights of present, former and prospective clients and employers. Note, as I said before, that this isn't just the current ones. So let's have a look. We are tracking through this, but we need to, because otherwise we won't get through it. So, Don Brash public speaking. Points are up there on the screen, but I'll summarise them for you again. You'll be aware of the controversy surrounding the public speaking rights of 2 Canadian visitors, and then soon after, Don Brash, who was denied the opportunity to speak on Massey University's campus. So, going back to respecting the rights of others to have their say, I have a couple of questions for you, which we'll bring up now. How are we going for time? Have we got time for two, or should we just do one? Okay. So the first question is, should the right to speak lawfully, i.e. not doing anything like inciting violence, etc., or overthrow of the government, should the right to speak lawfully also have a responsibility not to speak about touchy topics? Yes, no, can't say. And hopefully we'll wrap through this one quickly because we've got another question in a moment. And while you're doing that poll, I've given you a link on this page, hopefully it's on that page, to Massey University Professor Chris Gallivan's articles on the principles of discussion and the ability to disagree well, which is ideal for what we're talking about here in the Code of Ethics, which is respectful disagreement. Fabulous. Minimising hate speech. Yeah, so of course somebody's made a comment about touchy topics, whether they stray into the realm of hate speech. And that's the dilemma. There's the dilemma right there. So why don't I read this one out just while we've got it? So the comment was, as part of reinstating the EY award, they should have made sure that no member of EY was involved in the judging panel, as isn't that really where the conflict lies, in judging a piece about a client rather than it being entered in the first place? Yes, well, they needed to make a call on whether, if understanding that financial journalism is going to be about negative things as well as positive things, and EY would have an enormous breadth of clients. So I'd say there was a high likelihood that they were going to run into problems. Anyway, the poll, let's close it off at 86% of people voted. So should the right to speak lawfully have a responsibility not to speak about touchy topics? 11% of you said yes, you should have a responsibility not to talk about touchy topics. 89% said no, we should be able to talk about touchy topics. And everybody was decided. 0% said can't say. So yeah, so you're saying, close to 90% of you are saying, yep, touchy topics are legit. Let's move on to the next one. So the next question is, should the Code of Ethics offer more guidance on these types of matters? And again, if we can answer that as quickly as possible.
So just while everybody's filling that out, we've just had quite a few comments on the last poll. So who defines the touchy topic?
Good question.
How does the right to discuss touchy topics sit alongside the requirement in health and safety legislation to protect the psychological well-being of staff and students/customers?
Yeah, that's a very, and that was, I think, the reason given for the Massey University, that Massey University declined the opportunity for Don Brash to speak, as I understand it. So, we could argue that those health and safety concerns sit above the right to discuss something. Again, this is why it's very interesting delving into these real life issues, because you can have something which is, on the face of it, appears pretty straightforward, and then you start getting into the detail. So should the Code of Ethics offer more guidance on these matters? You're pretty much split. 53% said yes, 42% said no, and a small 5% said can't say. So sounds on balance as though more guidance is required, but not overwhelmingly. Yeah, interesting. And again, it's a moot point whether that should be in the code or whether appended to the code. I think probably appended to the code is the way to go. I think we've got to be very careful about having a code which is way too long.
We've had a good comment here. So we can't define every example that might apply. Our code should provide general guidelines, and then we trust and respect that our practitioners will make good decisions. they can always ask a mentor or colleague if they're concerned about ethical issues. And for that reason, we have a mentoring program.
And I love the comment in brackets, phone a friend. Let's take 50-50 out of the options. Okay, let's keep trucking on and move on to the next one, which is law, and final one, which is law abiding. So a member shall abide by the laws affecting the practice of public relations and the laws and regulations affecting the client. 12:45. Oh, crikey, right. Time is upon us. Okay, so learning the rules. So what it means about the, you go law abiding and you go, well, then we've got a responsibility to actually know what the laws and regulations are. So what I've listed here, just very quickly, some examples of some of the laws and regulations relating to public relations. The Commerce Commission has got great guidance on what businesses and can and can't say and do. I remember when we had a PRINZ conference presentation from the Commerce Commission, and they were talking about greenwashing. And the example given was that you can't just slap a picture of a dolphin or some greenery on a bottle of chemicals and expect that that's going to be okay, because even you're not saying anything, but the image that you're putting on there suggests that those chemicals are safe, and so that is out of bounds. Another consideration is leaving information out. So if you think about medicines and possible side effects of medicine, so it's not just a case of being truthful in the information you give, you have to give full information. If you work in the food industry, you'll know the food standards, Australia, New Zealand product recall requirements, for example. If you work for publicly listed companies or a publicly listed company, you'll need to know the rules for the stock exchange. We have a question there, but I think we might leave that one. We might just we'll take it as read that we should provide more information for you on regulatory frameworks, perhaps. Okay, moving on to the complaints process. So this slide covers the complaints or the process for an ethics complaint that I can just run through quickly. The complaint will be received by the National Office. Note that anyone can lay a complaint. It doesn't have to be a PRINZ member. Options for resolution are considered, particularly if it appears that it's a dispute situation. So if the complaint cannot be resolved and it's also not deemed to be frivolous, it will proceed to a hearing which will be held by the Independent Ethics Chair, Ursula Cheer, who is a law professor at Canterbury University, and 2 PRINZ fellows who are chosen for not being conflicted with the case that's being heard. The complainant and defendant cases will be heard. A decision is reached and announced, the bottom point. And the penalties for breaches, we don't impose fines. The penalties for breaches in the most serious cases would be expulsion from the institute, or censure, which in other words are telling off. We have very few ethics complaints, but for practitioners the burden of a complaint even being laid is really quite high, even if you're found not to be in breach of the code. So it really pays to know the code and to stay clear of any risk of a complaint being laid. PRINZ that now does actually appoint a person to sit alongside you if you do have a complaint laid against you, so that they can be your what's the word, Elaine? Support person. That's it. So practical advice, and we'll move on to this very quickly. Practical advice. Familiarise yourself with the code. Keep your ethical radar on for anything that seems dodgy. Be aware of anything involving subterfuge, that's as in undercover stuff. Obfuscation, these fantastic words. That being deliberately clouding the facts on an issue. Derision, e.g. what we saw in the Timberlands case, programmatically calling people extremists when they're clearly not. Or assumed identity, which is a massive issue on social media. Point 4, the boiling frog syndrome, if you're not familiar with that expression. That's the story goes that if you drop a frog in hot water and it can hop out, it will. But if you increase the temperature gradually, it won't realise what's happening and will eventually boil to death. I've been told it doesn't actually happen with frogs, but the story illustrates the point, and it's a very real point that just a great inching away from a point could leave you in big trouble. So when an ethical dilemma occurs, apply the front page of the newspaper test. There it is. If you were being publicly named for your actions, would you be embarrassed or ashamed? Is a good little test. Very simple. Consult with PRINZ colleagues or the PRINZ office for another opinion and support. Here's a good one. Explain the consequences of the reputation damage to an employer or a client. Often they don't think through those things, and this is part of your professionalism to say either you've got the experience or you know from others in the industry or from your training that this could lead the organisation to be in hot water, and it's worth considering, probably not doing. And finally, remember that professional ethics beats loyalty to unethical employers. How can we get the time? Next slide. So behaving ethically is easy when times are good, no crises, and you work for a decent organisation. And that's a very important observation, that working for a decent organisation, because so often, and in some of the examples that I've given at APR training, it's about the culture of an organisation. So organisations will lead people into unethical behaviour if they have a culture of unethical behaviour. There was the News of the World was described by one financial journalist as an ethics-free zone, a term that's just etched in my memory when they had the dramas that led to their demise. So choose who you work for carefully. And that observation leads nicely into the ethics pyramid, which I think I might do now. I'm going to skip a couple of slides. You'll see them because these just highlight some of the things that we've been talking about. But I do want to talk about this ethics pyramid. Here we are. So this was Elspeth Tilley's model, and the significance of this is systematically building ethics behaviour into each stage of your public relations or communications management programs, right from the research stage at the bottom of the pyramid through to the objective setting stage 2 and planning stage, and then through to the implementation at stage 3, and finally the top of the pyramid with your results and your evaluation. So if you can implement this holistic ethical approach in the way you work, you'll be moving away from the risks associated with ad hoc observation or knee-jerk reaction to ethical situations. And also, really importantly, you'll have your organisation on board with you, right? So it'll be inculcated in the organisation. So I really recommend this to you as the best possible way to ensure that ethical behaviour in your organisation and take away those risks of those unethical situations occurring and that you might have to confront. So a very powerful concept. And I'm just before we close, I'll give you, there's a whole sort of lexicon of terms that have sprung up around PR ethics. I mentioned greenwashing before, which is the deceptive use of green public relations and marketing. Pinkwashing is a variation. I don't know how real that is. It relates to breast cancer. Astroturfing I mentioned before. Here we go. Flogs are fake blogs that were set up by companies, and there are examples. And then blogola, where the hell do these terms arise? Paying for sponsored comments on blogs. But, given the power that blogs can have, then you can understand why that might happen. So as I mentioned before, we've got some reference material here for you. prwatch.org is a really good reference because it comes from the very distrustful people who are very distrustful of public relations. So it's very worthwhile having a look at that because you can see what those people consider PR people do and make sure that you don't fall into any of the traps. There's a website called prdisasters.com. Jerry McCusker has been a speaker at a few PRINZ conferences. He's great value. These two are a little bit dated, I must admit. The smartest guys in the room around the Enron collapse and the corporation, dated but still good value. Secrets and Lies, that's the Timberlands West Coast book. And I mentioned the Commerce Commission and the Global Alliance material, and also that piece from Matt, or the video from Matt Peacock from Vodafone Group, which I really recommend you have a look at. So there's a question. Are complaints made public? And I'm looking at Elaine as we do this because she's the process lady, so she can talk to you about at what stage complaints are made public.
When the office receives a complaint, the complaint remains confidential until the ethics committee has made a final decision. The reason for this is that the complaint may or may not be upheld, and in the instance where a complaint is not upheld, the Ethics Complaints Committee will have a decision or a recommendation on whether the details and the person involved in it should be named. Furthermore, a complaint may be withdrawn at any time, and so we've had a number of complaints received, yet they have not proceeded either due to lack of evidence or the complaint has been withdrawn, and for that reason, again, the details remain confidential.
Thanks, Elaine.
Cool. So there's a comment here. Tim, I'd like to hear your point of view about why there's no mention in our code about having a responsibility to advocate for stakeholders. I often need to act as the ethical lens for my organisation when it wants to do something that affects the community. So I think the point there, if you look at the code, is the responsibility to act in the public interest as well as in this. To be honest, I've often pondered, why would anything that is in an organisation's interest not also be in the public interest? And that would be, I guess, nirvana, is that anything an organisation did will always be in the public interest. But I guess that in a pluralistic world where we have conflicting, varying different views about things, then it's possible that there could be something that is in an organisation's interest and not in the public interest. I mean, that's something I'd love to debate with people. But coming back to your point generally, the code very clearly states that we should act in the public interest, and in my view, that will typically be in the interests of external stakeholders as well.
We've got another question for Elaine. So, are past complaints that are upheld and the outcome published on the PRINZ website?
Yes, they are. So of all the ethics complaints we've received in the past 20 years, there have been 2 that have been upheld. One is the Timberlands one, and the other complaint is the one that was made last year against the President-elect. Both outcomes have been published on the PRINZ website.
Right, so
hard to lump public interest as one amorphous group. I couldn't agree more. Of course it is. Or people have resigned from PRINZ. Yes, that's true. So,
however, the Code of Ethics, we've changed the membership declaration. So part of that now is that if a complaint is made against a member, the member cannot just resign, they must participate in the complaints process.
And the point's just been made by Catherine Arrow that PRINZ has guidelines for online engagement too, which go into more detail in that area. So we will make those available with the...
Yeah, definitely. I can send out a link to that with the recording.
Point about being aware of new laws that may be applicable, even though they were brought in elsewhere. GDPR is an example of this. Yes, and I think that's got to be part of PRINZ's role, is keeping an eye on those things and advising members, perhaps not in a legal sense, but at least keeping them up to speed.
Right, and I think that's everything.
Oh, cool.
Cool. If you have any last minute questions or comments, feel free to just write them in.
And so thank you everybody for attending. I think we've kept reasonably well to time, which is probably a first for me, particularly on this subject. So I will sign off. I don't know if Elaine wants to sign off separately.
Thanks everyone for joining. Have a good afternoon.
Okay, bye.